So the goal for this session today is to learn the differences between contracts and sub-agreements and how they can benefit your business process. And then it does help to be familiar with smart fields. We'll talk about them a little bit today. You'll get to see a little bit of, but the more you know about smart fields coming into this session, it will help out a lot more. So let's talk about contracts here first, because they're kind of the core focus of the session today. So contracts, in Dubsado, contracts are a secure way to communicate your general terms and obtain an electronic signature from your client. A contract can be customized from client to client using smart fields and is always easy to find on the left-hand sidebar inside of a project. When we get into Dubsado and we actually look at a project, I'll show you where that's at. But the big takeaway here with contracts in Dubsado, how you can think about them, is these should be more of your general terms and conditions. Whatever your standard contract is, or the main core contract of the project you're working on, that should be what the contract is reserved for. And one of the biggest reasons for that is with projects in Dubsado, they can only have one contract applied to them at a time, one core main contract. And we'll talk about sub-agreements a little bit later and how you can work around that. But you always want to make sure your main contract is the one that is in the contract position on a project. So contracts, that's the explanation behind them. Pretty straightforward there. So we're going to actually talk about building a contract template, what sets this apart from other forms inside of Dubsado. So the contract and sub-agreement templates offer two ways for your client to sign off on the document. And that's with a signature element and with a initials box. So what we can do here is we're going to jump into Dubsado. And if you're brand new to Dubsado, if this is your first time, where I'm at right now is on the left-hand side here underneath the Forms tab. And then we're going to be talking about contracts and sub-agreements here. Those are going to be the core ones that we'll talk about. If you are interested in any of these other three forms, we actually have been covering those throughout the duration of this workshop series. So feel free to go to our YouTube channel. All of them are uploaded along with the handout. So if you want to review some of these other forms, feel free to check those out in our YouTube channel. So with the contracts here, we're just going to jump into one, and I have a coaching contract that is pulled up. So one thing we're not going to cover, just to preface, is the jargon that you should have in your contracts. That's not really my area of expertise. If you want something to be legal, do not have me write your contracts for you. So we won't get into that today. But when you're building your contract, you can use all of these elements here on the side. So you can use images if you want to. Text box is going to be the core that you're going to use, because obviously you're going to be inputting the text for your contracts in here. If you need to capture any information, you could do short answers or yes, no questions, things like that. But what sets contracts and sub-agreements apart from any other form is the ability to sign off on them. And how you can do that is by using these two elements, the signature area right here, and then the initials box right there. So the contracts and sub-agreements, they're the only two forms that we have that have these two elements on them. You're not able to sign off on a proposal template or a lead capture or anything like that. What you would do is add your contract to your proposal. We talked about that a little bit last week, and then my colleague Sam is actually going to dive in deeper on Tuesday to talk about proposal, contract, and invoice a little bit more. So we have our contract here, we have our language, everything's in here, we're ready to put the signature element on here. So down at the very bottom of this form, you'll see that I have two different signatures here. And what you can do to add a signature is just click and you can drag it on there anywhere you would like to. It's super simple. It doesn't take much to get it on there. Same thing with the initials element. If you take the initials and drag that on there, it will pop up with a place for your client to initial. So either one, you can use those to have people sign off. But on this form, I have two things. I have a space for the client to sign off on, and I also have a place for the business owner to sign off on, or the service provider. So it is possible to have a signature area for both you and for your client. And how you can do that is, once you add a signature element onto a form, if you click on it, it's going to pop up with this little window here on the side, and all you need to do to specify if it's for you to sign as the business owner is just check this little box that says, is this for you, the owner, to sign? As when you click that, it's going to make it so it is considered the owner's or the brand owner's signature. So if I uncheck it, it just gets rid of that yellow text. So that's a great way to determine if you have that on your form. If I click on this and then add it, it's going to put the text in there for you to clearly see this signature field is for you as the business owner. So that's how you can tell just from at a glance if you have one on your form. Let me preface this also with saying that you don't need to have one on here. You may not need to have a place for you to sign. This is only if you need it on there. Most of the time, people might just have a place for the client to sign, and that's totally okay. But if you do need a space for yourself, you can add that in there. If you would like to change the text that it says, so here it says, I agree to the terms and conditions of this contract. If you needed to say something different, you can just change out the language there. So totally fine to add that in there. So now we have a client signature and we have a space for the business owner to sign. So let me jump back to my outline. I want to make sure that I don't get ahead of myself. One thing that I did forget to mention is a lot of people have questions on how is this legal? How does it work? Some people might have only done paper contracts throughout their business, and this is the first time that you're using electronic signatures. So basically what it does is when the client signs or they initial, it will track the client's IP address. So if it ever needs to go to court or be discussed or disputed, you can always go back and track the IP address, and we have all of that logged whenever someone signs a contract, so we can see exactly where that was signed from. So that's what makes when they signed it, the IP address and all that information there. So you can definitely send these out. They're legally binding, and it will lock them into whatever services you have on your contract. So we talked about adding a business owner signature. I kind of just continued through there. Two types of signatures, a space for the client, a space for the business owner. And now let's talk about countersigning contracts. So if we have this contract and it's all ready to go, we can send this through a project. So what we'll do here is we're going to jump into a project so we can look at the contract inside of a project. So we'll jump into one here. Was a sub agreement or a secondary contract, not their main contract, it would be a little bit tough to find. If you just went to the forms, you could find it essentially, but that's why we recommend having your main contract there, because when you get into a project, it's right up there in the left on the sidebar, super easy to find. So with a contract, there's a couple things that you can do when it comes to countersigning a contract. Because remember, we added a space for us to sign. So when this goes out to a client and they sign it, what you're able to do is, once the contract is signed, or there's a hack that we'll talk about here where you can sign beforehand, what you can do is, if you click this drop down here and click open on the contract, it's going to open up this contract as the business owner would see it. And that's very important, because if you open this up as the client would see it, then it wouldn't have the space in there for you to countersign. By opening it right here in the project, if we scroll down to the bottom of this contract, you'll see that where the client should sign is grayed out with the little cancel icon. So I'm not able to click in here and sign because I'm in the business owner view of this contract. I'm just opening it inside of a project. But the place that I designated for me to sign as the business owner is open, and I can come in here and sign. So if I want to come in here and I'll just put my name and I will in there. Now, once I have that signed, you'll see that there is a countersign button down there in the bottom right. So there's a couple things that you can do with this. Let's say that I've already sent this out to a client and they've signed it, and now it is signed in the project. I can do the same thing. I can go in now, I can open this up. It would already have their signature in there, and then I can click countersign. The other thing that you can do, because we do get this question a lot, is what if I want to sign before it goes out to a client? You can definitely do that. You can do exactly what I'm doing here, where before it goes out to the client, you can just click open, you can countersign it, and then it will be ready to go once you send it out to your client. So from here, I could send it, and when they get it, it would already have my signature on there. So feel free, whatever method you want to use, you can do that. One thing I will mention here as well, because we do get a lot of questions about it, is are you able to have contracts auto-signed so that it just comes with the signature? We don't have that possibility yet. The only thing that you can do so that it's on the contract before it goes to the client is to do this method here where you countersign it before it goes out. So that's how you can have that on there. Let me jump back to my outline here. So I put instructions here, really simple to follow on how you can countersign the contract. Another thing that's really great to have is, let's say you send out a lot of contracts and you have a heavy flow of projects that come through and you have a lot of work that you'll do. What you have on the dashboard for you is right here in the top, you'll see where it says X amount of contracts need counter signatures. So if you are a person where you're constantly going and you might forget to sign or countersign some contracts, you can just click on this button here and it's going to bring up all of the contracts that need to be countersigned. So that makes it really easy to see, and you can say, okay, these are the ones, and you can go through, maybe if you have some downtime or on a weekend, you can go through and countersign those contracts if you need to. So don't worry if you forget. You can always go to your recent tab and find all of the contracts that still need to be countersigned. And that's available for you on the dashboard. So that's how you'll countersign contracts. And then what I wanted to talk about are some tips for you. So I have 5 tips for contracts. The first one we already talked about, but I'll just read it here. We do not have a way to auto-sign contracts in Dubsado where it comes with your signature already pre-populated. If you would like to pre-sign it, just send it out before, or pre-sign it before you send it out to your client. And then that way it will already come on there when they receive it. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2, once the client signs a contract, an automated email will be sent out to the client with a copy of the contract for their records. So a lot of people might not be aware that this is something that happens in Dubsado, but for security reasons, and this is so the client will make sure that they have a copy, as soon as a client signs a contract, an email gets sent from Dubsado with a copy of that contract in there so they have it for their records. Now, a couple things with this. The email that is used to send out that contract completed email is underneath your canned email. So if you've never seen this before, if you want to edit this, change this around, this is where it's located. So underneath canned emails here, and then up at the top where you see edit templates, you'll click on that and then go to contract completed. This is the email right here that is a default email that goes out anytime that someone signs your main contract. There's not a way to shut this feature off in Dubsado. Again, it's more for security purposes, so that way your client will always have a copy of the contract. So here, if you don't like the way that this is framed as far as the wording, if you want to change it up, you can always change this, language here. The one thing that you'll want to keep in this email, though, is this right here, the hyperlink, or rather the smart field link to the contract. So that's going to populate a button for the client to click on to access their signed contract. So feel free to edit this email if you need to, but this is the default email that goes out anytime a contract is signed. And for those of you who are working on your workflows, if you're at that point in your Dubsado setup, because this automatically goes out to the client, you won't need to add this as a workflow action where you'll send a copy of the contract once they sign it. Dubsado is going to do that for you, so you don't have to add that as a workflow action. Okay. So with this, I showed you where that's at. There's not a way to disable the feature right now. Now, the other question that we do get a lot is, let's say that you send out a contract to a client, they sign it, and I haven't countersigned it yet. They will receive a copy of the contract without my signature at first, but once I countersign that contract, then the next time they open up that contract, your signature will be on there. So at first they won't have it on there, but as soon as you countersign, then it will automatically in real time get put on that contract. So they'll be able to see that the next time they click on the link. So super easy there. We do get that question a lot, so I wanted to throw that in there. Tip number 3, once a contract is countersigned, the copy the client received will be updated. Okay, we just talked about that one. Let's see here. Oh, I actually mixed that in and it's the same one. My apologies. I forgot to minimize that. Okay, number 4, we'll skip over that one. When building a contract, use a separate text box element for each clause in your contract. That will make it easier to include places for the client to initial and easier to edit down the road. So what I want to show you here, I'm actually going to use a sub-agreement as the example, and we'll talk about sub-agreements here in just a little bit. They're pretty much the exact same as contracts as far as having the client sign off on them. But let me open this here. It is my contract amendment. We'll open this up so you can see. So when you're writing your contract in Dubsado, what we usually recommend, and this is just so it will be a little bit easier for you, is sometimes businesses want the client to initial after each clause that they have. If you have a massive text box in your contract, you can't put elements inside of elements. So what we recommend doing is after each clause, so I have one text box for this clause. That way you can add an initials box underneath that clause if you need to. And then you can move on to the next clause, add that in there. And then if you want to, you can put another initials underneath there. So this makes it really easy if you ever need to edit one of your clauses. You're not opening up a massive text box and scrolling through a lot of text. You can just find it here, whichever clause you need to, make it its own text box. If I go back to the contract that we were looking at earlier, this contract, as you can see, is one big block of text. So let's say that after client responsibility, I need them to sign off on this. I can't take an initials element and drag it into this text box. So that's a big reason why we recommend doing clauses in different sections. So that way you can add those in there if you need to, or it's easier to update the text instead of scrolling through this big block of text here. So that's more of an aesthetics thing. It makes it easier for you as the business owner. So definitely take that into consideration if you're wanting to build your contract out or if you're just starting. And then my last tip here, we do get this question a lot, so I wanted to address it here. At this time, Dubsado does not support multiple client signatures on a contract or sub-agreement. If there's more than one person who needs to sign your main contract, what we recommend doing is using sub-agreements to capture additional signatures. And this will be something that we're going to add to our system at a later time. One thing I will say is that on a contract, it is possible to add in multiple signatures here. The only thing with this is two things that could cause problems. One is once a contract is signed in our system, it's locked. So you can't go back in and make any edits after that. So what you would have to do if you were to have multiple people sign on here is they would have to be in the same room at the same time and sign off. Because if one person signs it and then completes it, if it gets sent to another person, it's not able to be signed or edited past that point. So you can have them on there if you would like to, but then where you might run into issues is that if it does have to be disputed at a later time, what will pop up is the exact same IP address because it was signed on the same computer. So there's no way to differentiate if I just signed for two people or if it was that person who signed on this computer. So that's where you could run into issues as well if you were having them sign at the same time. So because of those reasons, we usually just say if you need an additional signature, use a sub agreement. Don't have them sign on the same contract as of right now, just because it wouldn't actually work the way that you're intending it to work. But this is something that we know is something that needs to be updated in our system, and our product team is going to put that on their timelines. It's actually already on there, but they're going to put that into the system at a later time. So awesome. So let me go back in here, and then we're going to talk about sub agreements, and then we're going to be all wrapped up for today. So it'll be a nice brief webinar here, but we'll talk about sub agreements. So because each project can only have one contract assigned to it at a time, you can gather additional signatures by using sub-agreements. And just like a contract, a sub-agreement includes spaces for the client to sign. They can initial off on sub-agreements, and they're really great for any amendments, additional signatures, waivers, releases, design proofs. And we're going to look at some examples here just so you can see what's possible with them. We love to spark creativity on these, so show you some examples and how you can think about using sub-agreements. So with sub-agreements, before we actually look at some examples, sub-agreements in Dubsado are considered just normal forms, similar to questionnaires, proposals. So where you're going to add in sub-agreements, because obviously in the top left here, that's where you're going to keep your contract. But if you want to add sub-agreements into the system, forms tab right here, and then when agreements up here, and then add those in. The submits, any of them is project. You don't need to any additional signatures that you need for any secondary. Okay, so let's look at some examples of sub-agreements so you guys get an idea of what's possible. So the first one we're going to look at is an annual renewal agreement. So this would be really great if, let's say that I signed a client in 2019 and they have a main general contract in their project. And let's say I don't really want to create a new project for the new year. My personal opinion is to do that, but let's say you want to have just one project and a continuous project, but you need to have them renew their services by signing a new agreement. What you can do is create a sub-agreement for the next year and have them sign off on that in the project. So that way you keep your main core signature that they signed off on in 2019. And then each year, if you want to keep the same project, you could just add in another sub-agreement for the next year of service that you're going to do with them if you want to keep the same project. So that's a way that you could use sub-agreements there. As far as the language, that's up to you again, but that would be a reason that you could use a sub-agreement is for an annual renewal of services. This one I actually really like, the coaching pledge. So a lot of times with coaches, they want the client to be emotionally invested in whatever service they're providing, whatever program they're providing. So a coaching pledge is a really cool way to have clients sign off on their participation with the particular service. So if I open up this coaching pledge here, it says things like, I pledge to give 100% to the process, regardless of how I'm currently feeling. I pledge to open communication in every session. So all of these different things are kind of affirming statements that you could send out to a client as something for accountability. So here there would be a space for them to sign, and then of course for you as the business owner to sign. So anything like this would be kind of a cool way where you just have these initials stacked on each other so they can go through and say, yes, I pledge to make every effort to attend each session unless drastic circumstances arrive, anything like that. So you can definitely use that for any type of accountability pledge or something like that. This is a very popular one. So with the contract amendments, a lot of times if there needs to be a change of service of any type, a lot of people don't want to delete the original contract because they want to keep that in the project. So any amendment to the terms and conditions of what you're doing, just so you can have both in the same project, use a sub-agreement for an amendment so that way you have both inside the project. This is very popular, especially with COVID going on right now. A lot of people are wondering, how do I have them sign off on new services? If you're in the wedding industry, I'm sure a lot of weddings have been pushed to, 2021. This is a great way to update the terms and services that you originally agreed upon and then have them sign off and still keep both contracts in the same project. So definitely use that for whatever you're needing. Logo and web design proofs. I really like these as well for anyone who's in the design field. So with a logo, we'll click on the logo design here. So with this, what you can do, because you can send out as many as you want to, all of your different rounds of proofing, or maybe you send out one proof that has, 3 different options on there. They're kind of choosing which one they want. You can put an image element in here, and you can just put in a blank image element. And then when you are about to send this out in a project, you can edit this form inside the project, and you can add in whatever images you want to go into this section here. And that's going to be your proof that you would send out to the client. The other great thing about this is if you want them to sign off on this, you can ask questions. What are your thoughts on this proof? All those types of things. But then you can also have them sign off on a proof if you need them to. So that's another great reason to use sub-agreements for proofing, is because you can add as many as you need to for your different rounds of proofing, and you can add in that signature element for them to verify, yes, I said this was okay to move forward. So use those for any proofing. And then the last one, this one's a really great one for anyone who is going to put pictures on their websites of people or photographers or anything like that. You can do a photo release form where you can drag an image in there so the client can see, these are the images that I need you to sign off on, saying it's okay for me to use you for promotional material or anything like that. You can just add in your jargon right here, and then you can have the client sign off on a photo release form or anything like that. You can also use sub-agreements for non-disclosure agreements, anything like that. I'm trying to think of some other examples that I've seen, but those are the core ones that most people use when it comes to sub-agreements. And you can basically use this and customize it to fit what you're needing based on a situational basis. One thing I will say here before we wrap up is that contracts and sub-agreements in Dubsado should not be recreated with government-issued forms. We do have a lot of people that write in and ask if they can recreate, let's say, like a 1099 or a W-2 and put that into Dubsado. You cannot do that. If you recreate that, it's not going to be the same government-issued form. It will not be validated by the government. So we do get that question. So I wanted to add that in there. Any government issued form, do not recreate it as a Dubsado form because that will not be recognized by any institution at all. So awesome. Well, that's all we have for today. It was a nice brief webinar, but hopefully this helps you understand the differences between contracts and sub-agreements, how you can use them effectively and spark some creativity when you're building those out.